I'll start recording as well. Now I'll start the webinar. 3 minutes, and then I'll show. Sorry.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming early. We just opened the webinar. Let's give other people a few minutes to log on. We'll start at around 8 p.m. Let's give it another minute also. People are posting messages already. It's 8:02. Shall we start? Okay. Good evening, everybody. Happy Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. Thanks for coming to tonight's webinar. My name is Vincent Wang. I'm a National President for AAPI, Asian Pacific Islander American Public Affairs. On behalf of the 3 hosting organizations, the Association of Chinese Americans for Social Justice, National Council for Chinese Americans, and AAPI, I'd like to thank the over 40 partner organizations for supporting this webinar series. I would also like to thank Stephen Chen, Kathy Huang, Jisoo and Xinsu for their leadership in making this webinar series possible. And the whole list of the 40 partner organizations can be found at the dedicated APA Heritage Month website. The website is usdandelion.org, usdandelion.org. There's a lot of articles there telling about Asian American stories. Hopefully you can check that website out as well. Asians have arrived in this land as early as in the 16th century and helped build the America as it is today. The purpose of this webinar series is to commemorate the achievements and the struggles of Asian Americans in this country, and also to discuss the path forward with the backdrop of the rising anti-Asian hate incidents and attacks in the midst of the global pandemic. We have invited 7 distinguished speakers over 5 webinars throughout the May month to help us accomplish that. These webinars take place in the same time, which is 8 p.m. Eastern time, 7 p.m. Central, 5 p.m. Pacific time on Saturdays throughout the May month, except for the 3rd webinar, which is on Sunday. The first webinar is today's webinar. We have invited the distinguished film directors, Ric Burns and Li-Shin to talk about their documentary, Chinese Exclusion Act. On the second webinar, it is on May 8th. We have invited UCLA professor Min Zhou to talk about the evolution of Chinese Americans and the model minority. 3rd webinar is taking place on the 16th. We have invited comedian Zhou Wang to talk about his experience from a PhD in the chemistry lab to become a stand-up comedian. The 4th webinar is on May the 22nd. We have invited the CEO and the director of Asian Art Museum of San Francisco, Jay Xu. He will talk about break the bamboo ceiling in the art industry. The 5th webinar is taking place on May 29th. We have invited Ju Li, the photographer for the Stanford University Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project, to talk about how he started taking photographies along the route of the Transcontinental Railroad to rebuild the moments 150 years ago. For today's webinar, we'll speak mainly in English and also provide some translation in Chinese. In the following 4 webinars, we'll mainly speak in Chinese and also provide some English translation. 今天的讲座我们主要用英文，但是我们会提供一些中文的翻译。尤其是其中涉及到4个视频，我们会把相应的中文的简介放到那个聊天的那个窗口里面，供大家参考。后面4个讲座呢，我们主要用中文。For today's webinar, I will be co-hosting with Haipei Xue and Professor Hua Wang. The speakers will take about 40 minutes to talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act documentary. During that time, we'll play 4 video clips and post Chinese translations. After that, we will have 20 minutes for questions and answers. Please submit your questions during the webinar using the feature on the screen. It is called the Q&A function. Use that function. That way we can keep track of your questions. We may or may not be able to answer all the questions, and also we may combine some of the questions to provide a more cohesive answer. Now let me briefly introduce our first speaker, Ric Burns. Ric Burns is a 6-time Emmy Award-winning director. He has been creating historical documentaries for public television for over 3 decades. He began his career co-writing and producing the celebrated PBS series, The Civil War, 1990, with his brother Ken and Jeffrey C. Ward, and has since directed over 30 hours of award-winning films. Among his body of work are some of the most distinguished programs in the public television series, American Experience and American Masters. The year of 2020 saw the release of two films by Ric Burns, Oliver Sacks, His Own Life, which explores the life and work of the legendary neurologist and storyteller, and Drive While Black, Race, Space, and the Mobility, which chronicles the history and the personal experiences of African American on the road from the advent of the automobile through the seismic changes of the 1960s and beyond. Ric's work has won numerous film and television awards, including 6 Emmy Awards, 3 Alfred DuPont Columbia Journalism Awards, 2 George Foster Peabody Awards, 2 Organization of American Historians Eric Barnove Prizes, 3 Writers Guild of America Awards for Outstanding Individual Achievements in Craft, Writing, and a D.W. Griffiths Award of the National Board of Review. Ric was educated at Columbia University and Cambridge University. Welcome, Ric.
Thank you so much, Vincent.
Now Dr. Hua will introduce our second speaker.
Good evening. My name is Hua Wang. I'm co-chair of New England Chinese American Alliance, president of UCAMA, president of Chinese American Association of Lexington. It's a great honor and a pleasure to introduce Ms. Li-Shin, an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker and co-director of the Chinese Exclusion Act, a longtime collaborator of Ric Burns. Their current film, Oliver Sacks, as Vincent mentioned, his life is a critic choice on the festival and the theatrical circuit. Their epic series, New York, a documentary film, an 8-part production of chronicling the city's rise from a remote Dutch outpost to the culture and the economic center of the world, for which Ms. received Primetime Emmy Award for outstanding achievements in editing. Their films over the years have garnered multiple awards, including Organization of American Historians Eric Bernard Prize for the Chinese Exclusion Act. Ms. Yi has collaborated with many filmmakers, including Jim Jarmusch, Spike Lee, Sarah Driver, Peter Wang, Christian Choi, Bill Moyers, Thomas Lennon, and Stanley Nelson, among others. Ms. Yi is currently directing another PBS documentary on the history of Chinese Americans, Plague at the Golden Gate, which is expected to be aired next spring. We could not have scripted a better kickoff event for the May AAPI Heritage Month. Without further ado, let's welcome Ric and Li-Shin. So the stage is all yours.
Thank you, Wang. We are so pleased to be part of, to be your kickoff program for APA month this year. Particularly, I think this year, everybody in our community and the broader community are all very, it's been an extraordinary year, very difficult on many fronts, but particularly now, all the anti-Asian hate crimes that we are all experiencing across the country. And I think it's just very appropriate for us now to look back at this history, at our American history. This Asian Chinese Exclusion Act is a history of all Americans, not just of Chinese Americans. So in what year was it, Ric? It was 2013 when we were first approached by Louise Muir of the New York Historical Society, who wanted wisely to do an exhibition about the Chinese Exclusion Act. And she approached Ric to say, would you like to make a documentary? And at that point, Ric looked at me and we were like, of course. And we joined forces with the Historical Society and began our long process of bringing this film to fruition. One more thing before I turn it to you, Ric. I just want to say that having worked with Ric all these years really taught me how to understand events in history are all related. It's all, it informs, you know, us, our present day, back to the beginning of our nation. And we very much wanted this film to reflect that. And Ric, you know, if you want to talk more about how we kind of kicked this off, I remember the first meeting we had at the New York Historical Society, in which we met this panel of amazing historian who became they became the backbone, the storyteller of our film. And I remember at that meeting, Scott Wong of Williams College and Rencho Yu of SUNY Purchase both presented a document, which is the Samson Bo quote from the New York Sun. I don't know, Ric, if you want to give some background to that, and then maybe we can show that clip.
Sure. You know, I just joined Li-Shin in saying how honored, you know, I am, and I know we both are, to be with you, and also very moved this evening in the midst of this complicated, terrible time, but maybe also hopeful in some ways. You know, I'll ask you, Li-Shin, maybe after we see the first clip, if you could have ever imagined, you know, when we started the Chinese Exclusion Act film, as you say, in 2013, that you would be walking down your own block in New York, on 108th and Broadway, just 2 blocks from where I am, your neighbors, to be verbally assaulted by someone in your neighborhood, which you've called home since 1980.
Yeah, no, it's really an extraordinary time. You know, both Ric and I we've been long collaborators, worked on many films in a very congenial and intense way, and never just, you know, Upper West Side, we're 2 blocks away from each other. Upper West Side of Manhattan, New York is sort of this liberal bastion. You know, we're in our little bubble where we think, you know, everybody, all people are equal, there's equal rights, there's equal justice. But in the midst of last year, as I was out on the street cheering our essential workers, you know, New York was doing this lovely moving thing where everybody's shouting out their windows, banging on their pants, just thanking the essential workers who were working tirelessly to keep all of us safe. Someone came up and yelled at me, telling me to go home, telling me that I don't belong, you know, just really getting increasingly intense. I took a video of it, but he started approaching me and I just had to back off. But to experience that is just pretty incredible. And, you know, reminds you that we need to continue to open dialogue, remember our history. And I think maybe we should play the first clip. I think appropriately, it will pose a very important question for all of us to consider. So,
Sir, a paper was presented to me yesterday for subscription among my countrymen toward the pedestal fund of the Statue of Liberty. My countrymen and myself are honored in being thus appealed to as citizens in the cause of liberty. But the word liberty makes me think of the fact that this country is the land of liberty for all men of all nations, except the Chinese. That statue represents liberty holding a torch, which lights the passage of those of all nations who come into this country. But are the Chinese allowed to come? Are the Chinese here allowed to enjoy liberty as men of all other nationalities enjoy it? Free from the insults, abuse, assaults, wrongs, and injuries from which men of other nationalities are free. By the law of this nation, a Chinaman cannot become a citizen. Whether this statute against the Chinese or the Statue of Liberty will be the more lasting monument to tell future ages of the liberty and greatness of this country, will be known only to future generations. Samsung Bo.
The prescience or the power of Samsung Bo is, letter to the editor of a New York paper. He had been soliciting for funds for the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty in the early 1880s. And the statue finally goes up in 1886. It's just, I'm so grateful to Samsung for the precision of balancing the statute barring Chinese workers and barring all Chinese from becoming citizens, which went into effect May 6th, 1882, to place the statute next to the Statue of Liberty so that one can feel the simultaneity of two very, very different impulses in American life. And that was really, Li-Shin, wouldn't you say, when we were starting the film, we realized, you couldn't start the film in 1882 with the beginning of the Chinese Exclusion Act. As you were saying, it's so embedded in a long Euro-American relationship to this continent and then to the rest of the world. And I just, thinking back now, Li-Shin, what your sense was of this project, which seemed, it didn't seem sort of antique or archival to any of us. At the same time, it seemed it was new. It was not something well known, not something taught in American schools. And as Samsung Bo makes clear, that's a crime on the one hand that it's not, to the degree that it's not. It's a huge missed opportunity. You're muted, Li-Shin.
In our first meeting, that was the document that was presented to us. I think we instantly sort of understood that that is where the film needs to begin. I mean, this whole idea that our country would ban and name a specific group of people as being unwelcome. At the same time, our idea of the country, represented by the Statue of Liberty is so strong. And here is someone who, in our past, who was denied citizenship and denied the sense of belonging in this country, was so acutely saying, well, America, are you for the Statue of Liberty or are you for this document that denies rightful belonging to an entire group of people? And so that is just where our exploration of this history began. So where did it begin? How did it begin? Why could this country come to that conclusion at that point in time? And, you know, as Ric was saying, we need to go back, way back at the beginning of the formation of our country. When here we are, you know, we won the Revolutionary Independence War from Britain, but then where do we find ourselves? War-torn, poor country. And what do we do? You know, at that point in time, we right away thought about, okay, the China trade, commerce, that interconnection of commercial relationship will allow us to build up our nation. And that is still an idea I think American has. Every industry, you know, wants a piece of the action in China, you know, because that is where where we can find prosperity, trade prosperity. And were you about to say something, Ric? Sorry.
I'm going to speak loudly because I think my audio is really bad. I hope I can make it better simply by shouting a little bit. Yeah, I think one thing that was really striking to me thinking about it right now, Li-Shin, was, you know, we have this kind of hazy idea that we're a land of liberty. That's what the statue very clearly evokes now and has for some time, though it was, you know, has had different meanings over time. But it's funny, we then sort of go, well, we've always been a nation open to immigrants, right? That's what that lady in the harbor means. Welcome, bring us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Then it turns out to be that this hazy general notion over which the iconic image of the Statue of Liberty presides is very different from the specificity of the actual history. And I love the fact that statute, the document, has a T on it, a little stinging T at the end of it. It's not a kind of a blurry statue. It's a very sharp statute. And it makes me feel that history needs to come in like a little bit like a wasp that stings you like the T at the end of statute and gives you the real information, without which everything will sort of dissolve into sort of a blurry, well, you know what, we're really a nation of immigrants. We weren't a nation of immigrants in the sense of welcoming immigrants of any kind until after the Second World War. We let them in, but you know, the Irish were thought of as being a substandard species. Jews were lamented. Italians were a kind of a swarthy, dark Mediterranean race, as opposed to the more Nordic, pure Northern Europeans. So it's the reality of the history, the details of it take us very deeply into something which we must pay attention to. Otherwise, we get this blurry, rather medicated version of history, in the context of which all sorts of absolutely preposterous ideas come in. So, you know, I feel so grateful, Li-Shin, that we had the opportunity to work on this film when we did. And I'm so struck by the fact that over the years, the meaning and the importance of this piece of the Chinese American history, the Chinese Exclusion Act, just kind of continually grows in its importance, and it shifts and it tells us different things. Every year, I learn something new about the Chinese Exclusion Act because the world is changing around us. I hope I'm audible.
I think it is also, you know, as you're saying, we now perceive ourselves as a nation of immigrants, of embracing all peoples and all groups. And I think we also need to look back into history. You know, this history is Chinese Exclusion Act history is dark, but it is also filled with inspirational, hopeful moment, because Chinese Americans from the very beginning almost understood before Americans did what this nation could stand for, and fought back every step along the way to give ourselves a voice, to give ourselves agency, to understand that, you know, we belong here as much as anyone. You know, we were all immigrants, so to speak. Even, you know, the Mayflower Americans who came are
Especially the Mayflower.
Especially them. You know, what did they come for? They came for opportunity. They came for a new start. But that is what all immigrants do from that day to today. And but going back to sort of we're all in this together. And I think so much of the hate or even misunderstanding within all communities about how, oh, you know, we're different or they're different is something all of us need to overcome. And a big part, I think Ric was talking to one of our advisors, Jack Chen, who Ric asked, you know, well, Jack, what is the essence of this film? And without a beat, he goes, the 14th Amendment. And I think we have to remember, how did the 14th Amendment come about? It was a civil rights amendment fought by African Americans, you know, throughout and through the Civil War years. And it was enacted after the Civil War. And that was something, the 14th Amendment was something that Chinese could then use to fight for our rights. So perhaps we can play the second clips and we can talk about that further, Ric.
This is the era when all of the promises of the Civil War are going to start falling apart. After the Civil War, we get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And those are all civil rights amendments. The 13th abolishes slavery. The 15th gives Black men the right to vote. But the 14th Amendment grants all civil rights to all persons.
On July 9th, 1868, just 3 weeks before the Burlingame Treaty was concluded, the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution was formally adopted. Despite bitter opposition from most states of the fallen Confederacy, which were forced to ratify it to regain representation in Congress. Overruling the Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott, which had denied citizenship and all civil rights to Black Americans, the 14th Amendment's Citizenship Clause declared that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States, who cannot be deprived of life, liberty, due process, civil rights, or equal protection under the law. In the decades to come, the spare 80-word text would form a last slender line of defense for the Chinese in America, as the country began a long, slow descent into an abyss of hatred and violence, directed against all people of color.
February 6th, 1869, Chicago. We warn working men that a new and dangerous foe looms up in the far west. Already our brothers of the Pacific have to meet it. And just as soon as the Pacific Railroad is completed, these Chinamen will begin to swarm through the Rocky Mountains like devouring locusts and spread out over the country this side. Men who can work for $1 a day are a dangerous element in our country. We must not sleep until the foe is upon us, but commence to fight him now. In the name of the working men of our common country, we demand that our government forbid another Chinaman to set foot upon our shores. The Workingman's Advocate.
You know, Li-Shin, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
You know, we've said this many times. The Chinese Exclusion Act, the response to the Chinese first coming into California after 1849 and 50 with the gold rush, then famously helping to build the railroad, that history is not a piece of American history. It is a central component of American history. Immigration rights, worker rights, borders, the 14th Amendment. I mean, it's amazing how much absolutely critical American history you cannot understand if you don't understand this first, you know, the Chinese were not the only people who were treated with hostility. The Irish were not greeted with open arms in the 1840s. But they were allowed in, and there's certainly no question that they would ever have been legally banned, constitutionally banned in the United States. And what's striking to me is how that last quote, you know, could be spoken about Mexicans coming over the border today. So what you see is you see the DNA of the American relationship to immigration, which has been deeply, deeply ambivalent from the start, as so many of our consultants and historians pointed out in the film.
And it is based on the 14th Amendment that Chinese use to fight for our rights. You know, this history, I think what we today, you know, I became a citizen. I'm an immigrant. I became a citizen in 1984, right around the time where there was this horrendous incident surrounding Vincent Chin, who was in Detroit. The US auto industry was tanking, and a lot of workers were unemployed. And right then, as back in history, as in today, Chinese, or at the time, it was Japanese American, but anyone who looked like a Japanese American were targeted. And Vincent Chin was killed, you know, beaten to death with a baseball bat in a parking lot as he was out on his bachelor's party, as he was getting ready to get married. And at the time, as a young new immigrant, it is incredibly disheartening and confusing. You know, you're filled with rage, and you're filled with uncertainty. You know, you just feel helpless. You wonder what you should do, how you should do. Do you belong? Have I made the right choice to come here? All of those things, I think many people probably, you know, are feeling today. But I think if we then look back through this history, we have to also see that constantly, you know, you need to stand up, you need to speak up, you know, across communities. And Chinese use the 14th Amendment again and again to fight for their rights. You know, the two most famous incidences, Iqua v. Hopkins, which established equal protection under the law, and Wong Kim Ark, which establishes birthright citizenship. And it is Chinese understanding, you know, you can't sit back. You have to stand up and fight. And I think we are once again at that moment in time where we need to continue to do that, not just for ourselves, but, you know, African Americans fought for the 14th Amendment. We received the fruits of that fight. And so every action everyone takes benefits everyone else. And that I feel is a strong lesson we need to learn from history as well.
And the birthright citizenship is astonishing.
Right.
Anybody born in America knows they're American because they were born here. But that wasn't the case before 1898, before in this landmark ruling, a son of San Francisco, born of immigrant Chinese parents. As the 1890s became even more savage and severe, especially in places like California against the Chinese, they decided they would try to push back as hard as they could the state officials of California. And that case of a son of San Francisco, a birthright American citizen, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and that it was decided clearly once and for all. If you're born here, you're an American citizen. That's why I was born in Baltimore in 1955. Therefore, I know I'm an American. Thank you, Wang Kim. That would not have been the case. I could not have said that with anything like this, the same clarity and certainty in 1897. But thanks to Wang Kim in 1898, and everybody born here since knows that, which is just one of those ways in which denied citizenship and therefore denied the right to vote. How do you express your citizenship? You go to court. And the number of court actions, tens of thousands of court actions filed by Chinese and Chinese Americans in the second half of the 19th century. It's one of the most moving and beautiful acts of American patriotism, solidarity with justice, I think that as any that exists in American history. To stand up without being able to vote and find a way to make the Declaration of Independence read in the words that it's written. All men, or as we now say, all men and women are created equal. And that these laws apply as the 14th Amendment insisted to everyone. It's an incredible, I feel like Wang Kim, his face should be engraved on Mount Rushmore. When you think about what he did to define what it means to be an American and what the central values are.
Yeah, I think, so many Americans are unaware of that. And it is, as Ric, you say, it is, we can be proud that it was a Chinese American who stood up and made that, forceful understanding of what that piece of legislation it means to all of us. I think our time is running short. I think we should just jump to the last clip number 4, and we'll wrap it up and open it up to questions from the viewers.
Over a century ago, the Chinese came here in search of a better life. During the California...
When we look back, I think we can learn that the Chinese have this resilient faith in the founding principles. I think that's Chinese Americans' contribution to this grand American experiment. The exclusion law can be seen as a fundamental flaw, a huge mistake in that historical process of great experiment. I think if you really look at this system, you can also say that, the exclusion law was democratic, was legal, but it was wrong. So something wrong could be done in that process of building a democratic system there. On the other hand, even under the enormous difficult circumstances, with so many disillusions, so many disappointment, and so much suffering, generations of Chinese Americans never give up their faith and their hope. And I think that's very remarkable.
You know, I really love that that is the last thought that we give to our viewers, because, you know, when you think about the Chinese Exclusion Act and all the injustices and violence towards Chinese throughout that period of history, it's you can become, you know, you can freeze from not knowing what to do, but understanding that history, you know, as Rin-Cho beautifully put it, it could be democratic, it could be legal, because it was legally passed as a legislation by our representatives, but it could be wrong. So if we understand that things that are happening, just because they happen doesn't mean that it's correct, you know, as we are witnessing now. And I think we can all take heart, understand that, and, you know, continue the fight, continue the legacy that was given to us to pick up and move forward. Do you have a parting thought, Rick, or we should open it up to?
I will say that, you know, one of the most frequently cited, it's the cliche lines of the novelist William Faulkner, is that history isn't was, history is. But it's not the past, it's the present. And with this history that you've seen a few clips from, the way it speaks to the present, we had no idea when we made this film that we would be here now. And the sense of the fragility of the experiment that Ren-Cho Yu is describing so beautifully. It was fragile 5 years ago. It's even more fragile right now. And it's astonishing to see this constant dialogue which the present is having with history, and how much is on the line. So, you know, I take heart from the men and women who helped us make this film and the story it tells, because it's really a story of amazing perseverance in pursuit of value and justice. That's a shining example. But yeah, absolutely, it'd be great to have any questions.
Yeah. It's really, I feel, been an honor to be able to have made this film. So thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Li-Shin.
Thank you, Rick and Li-Shin. This is such a wonderful film and also wonderful dialogue between the two of you. You have done so much, and you devoted so much to this film, and I can see how complex it is, and given all the history and also the lack of historical records. So how did you come about doing this at the beginning? Like, what kind of challenges did you face?
Yeah, it's always, well, what do you look at? And I think, you know, the storytelling part is really the historical documents. You know, those court cases, you know, the photographs that were attached to these cases were sort of the sources. And I think, I feel like I'm a broken record now, but I often say to Rick, you know, these historical artifacts they are still here, and they live through that history, you know. So we need to treat them with almost with honor, to film them in such a way that they deeply reflect what was going on at the time. So so we spend a lot of time finding those documents that are the most crucial, or finding that, you know, written texts, you know, or the poems on the walls of Angel Island, and have someone write it out in Chinese traditional calligraphy, just to highlight, the voices from the past that are reaching out to us to let us know about this story.
I mean, I think that you said it so beautifully once, Li-Shin, that the archival record is the hero of the story. These humble documents, citizenship papers or passes or, identity cards, as the Chinese were uniquely in American history required to carry. That they become these eloquent, they testify to the history. And for anyone who doubts it for a second, look at the date and the signature on the legislation itself, and look at the identity cards, and look at the newspaper records, look at the transcontinental railroad. Suddenly, it turns out to be this central fact. The railroads built America. We have America because of the railroads. We have the railroads because of California and the West, and we have the railroads because of the Chinese. So there are ways in which the story leaps from a scratchy document or a virulently racist newspaper article to, what was really the moonshot of the 19th century, building the transcontinental railroad, the first one in particular. And so this kind of dialogue between things that are so humble, picking cotton as Chinese now, coming inland after the gold rush are now, and after the Civil War, are now taking the place of African-American farm workers who have been themselves freed. I mean, these just, everywhere you push in on this story, there's some aspect of it which is knit into central aspects of the history. And I love as Li-Shin has pointed out, the simple eloquence of the documents and what they speak to.
Thank you.
Yes. So yeah, thank you, Ric and Li-Shin. This is really, thank you for coming here tonight. And then you can see from the audience that they have many burning questions. We're going to try to get them to you. And so one of the things that the audience was also, asking us is the following. So with the tragic rise of anti-Asian crimes and incidents, right? And the national media has paying attention to it. And really, there's two burning questions it's on people's mind. And why is this happening? Is history repeating itself? And so, can you comment on how documentary films such as the Chinese Exclusion Act can help to shed light on the white part and for the Stop Asian Hate movement? And then the second question I'll ask here so you guys can comment together is people also saying, what can we do? We have received a lot of support in the community, but everybody say, what can we all do? And one of the things we've been advocating is the incorporation of AAPI history and culture in K-12 curriculum. This is of course for the benefits of all students and society. And in fact, the Chinese Exclusion Act and the PBS series, Asian Americans, and these are considered the primary materials for such education. So can you two comment on this?
Go ahead, Li-Shin, you're muted.
You're muted, Li-Shin. Okay.
Yes, I mean, I think it's sort of all along what I was trying to say. We are, our production partner, CAAM, Center for Asian American Media, has created a wonderful, along with the Oakland School District, curriculum that could be shared and used in schools, K through 12. But should it be mandated? Of course, I think it should. How does one make that happen is probably another long and difficult struggle. I think the key about for people to understand is, as Ric was saying, this is American history. This is not just like a sliver of Chinese American history. It is all of our history. And the more we understand that, the more we can understand why, for example, I've always felt, okay, how do we stop history from repeating itself? It seems like we constantly go through this cycle, and we're in this cycle again. But I'm increasingly feeling like, well, you know, if we don't understand who we really are, you know, it would be very difficult for us to take the next proper step. Yes, we think it's repeating itself, only because we don't know that it happened before, you know. So the more we understand that, and the more we understand, oh, you know, America is complicated, that, you know, we have these complicated pasts. So the more we understand that, the more we can define, well, we have these ideals. Is that who we really want to be? And if that is who we want to be, then what are the course of action we need to take to attain that?
I mean, I also think that very much in keeping with what you're saying, Li-Shin, that when you see things that remind you of the present, having happened again and again in the past, in other words, if your history lessons show you that, you know what, oh my God, in this uncanny way, after the economic downturn in 1873, a huge crash followed by the worst depression of the 19th century, the savagery towards Chinese increased. And when you see again and again that there is a pattern, it's not just, you know, that sense that if you are part of the dominant, racially dominant majority who feel that something's being taken away from you, and you see that every time there's a crisis, scapegoats are found. And the Chinese were the first such scapegoats. And so it becomes harder. You have to own it in a different way if you see that again and again, the same thing is being played out. So one thing I think is simply to say, okay, if you want to feel that somehow in the 21st century, it's now time to return American citizens to the country that their great-grandparents came from. Okay, let me give you a little bit of history of how that feeling, that antagonism, that racism, and that bigotry has been sewn into the fabric of American culture again and again and again. If you still wish to be that way, we lament that fact. But it's a little harder to hold on to it straightforwardly when you see it as part of a larger pattern that has deep, deep, deep roots. And so I feel kind of, as an amateur historian, you know, I feel, you know, history is not the panacea. It's not the thing that will cure every ailment. But I feel very strongly that if you tell a story that's powerful and true about the past and it resonates with the present, it's possible for people to at least think twice about some of their more reflexive and instinctive ways of responding. But to second, the CAAM, the Center of Asian American Media, I mean, the work they've done is really, really fantastic. And I feel it should be mandated. How else are you going to know about immigration? How else are you going to know about citizenship? How else are you going to know about the Statue of Liberty? You know, these are American values, American realities. And, you know, only by studying the history do you understand how and when we became a nation of immigrants. It was a book by John F. Kennedy when he was a senator, published in 1957, when in the Cold War, America decided it was now time to seem a little more welcoming, and maybe time to lose the shadow of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which seemed an embarrassment to a country that was trying to wag its finger as being more morally upstanding than communist countries around the globe. So I just, you know, education, and it should be part of the mainstream K through 12.
Thank you for that. And in the past couple of years, especially with the pandemic and also the rising anti-Asian hate sentiment in the country, and also in the meantime, there's a lot of energy in the Asian American community to basically speak up, make our voice heard more, and make ourselves visible. And there were rallies and speeches, and also actions taken at the legislature level and also education system. Like there are multiple efforts to trying to basically ask the school system to include more Asian American history education. So there are a couple of questions in the audience. One is, how can we leverage this film for education purpose? Some audience worry that this may be, there's a lot of subjects in it, and maybe adults and older kids, they can understand it. What about the younger kids? How can we leverage the work you have done to benefit younger folks?
I think, you know, if we emphasize the inspirational aspects of this history, of all the legal fights, of, you know, Tate v. Hurley, you know, in 1885, a young Chinese girl was refused admission to the public school system, and how the family stood up using, once again, you know, 14th Amendment to say, no, this is not right. They stood up and you know, fight. So if incidences like that can be turned into stories for younger children, it will, I think, you know, allow the young generation to begin to understand, yes, we can have agency. We can, you know, understand that you don't need to sit back and take it, you know, which might be more kind of, many Asians tend to do that. You don't want to be the nail that stick up. Well, sometimes you need to do that, right? And if you show examples of success story like that, I think it can be very meaningful for younger children.
Yep. Rick, any thoughts on this?
I think that, you know, what I certainly was struck by, you know, in this whole history is how much, you know, it both changes your sense of American history, but also deepens it in exactly the same way. I mean, I'm talking to you from New York. You know, when Li-Shin touched on this, when the Revolutionary War was over and America had won its independence, the first thing that its former colonizing country did was exclude it from any trade with the British Commonwealth. So United States of America, good luck with that. Who are you going to trade with? You can't trade with Great Britain or any other country in the Commonwealth. You know, first ship that leaves New York Harbor in 1783 heads straight for China. You get involved in trade with the Chinese, the one uncolonized country that they could do business with. Wow, so it turns out, you mean way back, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, right from the very beginning, we have been this little tiny, you know, nation that had just fought and won its Revolutionary War. Its economic independence now is absolutely dependent upon opening up a system of relations, economic and cultural, with China. Gee, I didn't know that when I was, you know, taught about 1776 and the American Revolution. So there's this way in which all these signature moments in American history, from the Revolution to the Civil War and on, are an enormously powerful light is shed on them by looking at this history. And I think that it's something I like to think, that these histories that Li-Shin and I have been fortunate enough to be involved in making, I think they should be available to anybody. They're not, you know, we try not to talk down, but at the same time, we try to just tell it in the most powerfully narrative way we can, so that so that what's at stake is there. So I would love to see a curriculum in which at least parts of the film are made available to fourth graders. Fourth graders could absolutely get what Samsambo means. And meantime, they would discover an enormous amount about the history of America in the post-Civil War period, the Gilded Age, when the Statue of Liberty went up. So the battle really just has begun.
Thank you. I think we have 2 more questions. Hua, you want to bring up the first question?
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Li-Shin and Ric. And so some of the questions from the audience, they're sort of asking, when you guys, produced the film back this many years ago, did you foresee that what's happening, like now? And does it also mean there's a dark age, for the Asian American in this country? Because one of the things, this Chinese Exclusion Act, right? It's a grim subject and a damning look at how the American government, right, fostered the racism, really. So has this document, achieved its purpose of fighting that, and improving, basically making this nation a more perfect union?
Every step forward, all of us feel, I feel this, every time there's a step forward, for example, the civil rights victories of the 1960s, the temptation is to go, oh, we've won. But then time goes on and it turns out that it's the same country. It's made a major step forward, as we did when we got rid of the Chinese Exclusion Act, as we did during the Civil Rights period, which is when the Chinese Exclusion Act was finally rescinded. But time went on and it turned out to be many of the same strands and currents in American history were still alive. And they were always alive. And so there's a constant dialectic, a pushing and a pulling that takes place. And I think it's the usefulness, I hate to put it this way, the usefulness of the difficult moment we're living in right now is the revelation it holds for all Americans about how much work we have yet to do. And if 4 years ago or 5 years ago when we completed the film, it may have seemed like we were a little further ahead than we are now, that may have been more an appearance than a reality. And I don't think we're heading so much into a dark age as heading into one of those eras in American history where when white privilege is threatened by whatever circumstance, there's a very strong white tendency to reach out in an aggressive and hateful way. And so the combination of the economic situation and the pandemic, what you saw was this kind of really, closing the door in a way that can't even be really done anymore. And so I think it's at the very least useful to know these realities with a certain kind of plainness so that we can understand that the fight is not over, not be surprised, not be happy, but understand that the fight goes on. And so I feel that the product of the last 4 years of American history in particular has been how much work is yet to be done. And the example of the Chinese during the period of the Exclusion Act is one of such enormous leadership and articulation of value and standing up. I mean, after all, they could have said, look, what a hell of a terrible country this is, America. Riddled with hypocrisy, racism. What a disaster. That's not what the Chinese said. They said, look, let's look at what's most promising. Let's look at the values and what men and women who have fought to have those values enshrined in law have accomplished. Let's do them the enormous service, those people who have fought so hard by fighting hard ourselves. So we now live in an America where 2040, America will be the largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. I embrace that, but I guarantee you that is not embraced by all Americans. But that's the reality. And the reality of this polyglot, complicated, global culture, of which America is one of the leaders, is that it is getting richer and more diverse, richer in its diversity. And that's going to go on. No one can turn that back. That's an arrow of time that is irreversible. And we need to, those of us who understand how both justice and beauty are informed by that fact, need to help those who might be having a hard time getting it to be a little bit more aware of what an extraordinary future lies ahead of us. Li-Shin?
Yeah, it's I totally second every single word you said, and it is sort of again, the fight continues. From day one to today, our entire history is about understanding or coming to an idea of what it is that we want. What is the vision that we want? And for anything, if you're building a company, you have to start with a vision and you work towards that. And you will have setbacks and you figure out how to improve it. So this is, the same kind of work that we're going through. What is the ideal? What is it that we want ourselves to be defined as? And work towards that. It's not going to be fast or easy. It might take generations. It certainly will take generation, but each step, hopefully, one step forward, two steps back. Maybe next time we'll take 3 steps forward. So we have to continue to be vigilant, and we need to have our voices heard. We need to vote.
That's exactly right. And we are running short of time, but we have one last question. Other questions we can just funnel back to you at a later time. And definitely this documentary is a wonderful piece of work, and you devoted so much energy. And we thank you for your vision in putting together this project, a lot of hard work into it. And you shared a little bit about how do we look at the future. Obviously, we, as part of the community work to make our voice stronger, we need to constantly refer back to this piece of work to get inspiration to think about our future. In terms of yourself, professionally or personally, what's your plan? What kind of a new project are you working on that you would like to share with us?
Mm-hmm. Well, right now I am in the middle of planning another film for American Experience. It's currently called Plague at the Golden Gate. It's another piece of history that most people don't know about, that in 1900, the bubonic plague was in San Francisco, and it started in Chinatown. So it's again feeling like history is repeating itself. Here is this pandemic in the city that officials are denying for various reasons, fearing the loss of trade. And then, well, it happened in Chinatown. So let's blame the Chinese, for the cause of it. So there is much, again, to be learned from that history. And once again, Chinese back then fought back in the courts. So, so that's what I'm working on now. Ric is working on, a number of amazing projects, but I'll let him tell you.
Yeah, the one that Li-Shin was working on too until about 2 months ago when she moved to direct this film on the plague at the Golden Gate, and we'll get her back to continue on this film about Dante, the Italian poet who died 700 years ago this year, and was exiled from his home city of Florence, trying to make a better life as a politician for his people. and never went home again, and instead wrote a 14,233 line poem, which goes to hell and purgatory and up to heaven. And I've never felt that I've ever read anything more relevant to the world we're living in today than Dante's Divine Comedy. So it's been once again one of those things where the history of now changes and focuses the history you're working on. But really, thank you, Vincent, and all for including us here this evening. It's an honor.
Yes, just thank you for all the organization partners for allowing us to share this, our thoughts with you. Thank you for the good work. Continue the good work, the good fight. Really an honor to be on your program here.
And let us know.
That's what we call good trouble, right? Making good trouble.
Making good trouble.
Thank you, Ric and Li-Shin. This is wonderful, and we are honored to have you and also provide your thoughts and insights about this film and also about the movement to make our voice heard more. And definitely we will look up to you to seek guidance in the future as well. And also looking forward to see your new products coming out. And thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It's been lovely to be with you.
And also thank you. And one of our supporters and is United Chinese Americans, and is President Hai Pei. He's here, and I'd like to invite Hai to share some thoughts.
Hi, what an amazing evening we have had. My name is Hai Pei Xu, President of UCA, United Chinese Americans. Thanks again on this beautiful evening for our audience and the questions that we have had for our two distinguished speakers, Li-Shin and Ric. Now, ever since the end of the Second World War, many Americans have thought about that the US government should apologize for the Chinese Exclusion Act. And many have tried to make a documentary about it. But it took two amazing citizens, Li-Shin and Ric, years of effort to finish that. And now we have such an amazing gift from you two. Thanks. There are so many ways we can look at the Chinese Exclusion Act. There's of course the deep-rooted racism, bias, misgivings of China, ignorance of Chinese people, and economic depression and rivalry. But I think the biggest lesson we can learn is, as a citizens of this multi-ethnic democracy, we have to organize, we have to be civically engaged, we have to vote, we have to donate, we have to reach out to all Americans and not just hide behind our little community or otherwise known as Chinatown, old or new. In short, we have to be fully engaged as American citizens and as owners of our own democracy and our own destination. Otherwise, it is still possible that history could repeat itself in various forms. As our community today has increasing concerns about, despite of the great progress we have made as a nation and with each other. With your gift, Li-Shin and Ric, we finally can convincingly educate ourselves, educate our next generation, and indeed educate all Americans. America will be a much better place because of this documentary and because of you. Thank you for the wonderful co-sponsoring organizations and the entire team here, and especially Huang Chen, whose tireless and persistent efforts had made this evening possible. I think we have some new ads or film to play now, or otherwise I'll say good night.
Thank you so much for those beautiful words.
Thank you, Happy. And just as a reminder, we talk about we are having 5 webinars. This is first webinar. Great start. Thank you so much, Ric and Li-Shin again for great contents, great work you have done. So on the next Saturday, May 8th, we have our second webinar. Wen is going to show the flyer for all the speakers, audience, organizers. Please take a picture of this. And there's a QR code. If you scan it, you can register for the next webinar. Then you will receive a automated reminder of the webinar next week. We'll pause for 2 seconds. Obviously, you can see that on our social media and also usdannyline.org website as well. All right, thank you again for coming tonight, and hope you have a good night. Good first day of the May Asian Pacific American Heritage Month.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night, so long. See you next Saturday.
Good night. Thanks, Li-Shin. Thanks, Ric.
Thank you very much, Ric and Li-Shin.
Thank you all again so much.
Good night.